Israel's blockade of Gaza, they did agree that Israel had the right to prevent weapons from entering Gaza. I'll leave aside the disputable question about whether the people of Gaza have the right of armed resistance to end that brutal 40-year-long occupation. But even if you believe that they did not have the right of armed resistance, the fact remains, as Amnesty International has said, that both sides, the Palestinians and Israel, are consistent violators of human rights, and therefore there has to be a comprehensive, total arms embargo, not just on the people of Gaza, but Amnesty International says there has to be a comprehensive, total arms embargo on Israel as well. It will probably never be known what exactly happened on that fateful night of May 31st, when Israel launched its attack on the Mavi Marmara, leaving at the end 9 of the passengers aboard the ship dead. In fact, just today, for those of you who are interested, the first major report by a human rights organization on what happened on the Mavi Marmara, it just came out, and I was reading it on the car on the way over. It strikes me as remarkably professional and remarkably serious. I can't report to you right now on exactly what it said, because I want to go through it more closely. The important point for our purposes, and this point is confirmed in the report that came out today, it's completely irrelevant what happened on that fateful night, because Israel had no right whatsoever to impose the blockade on Gaza in the first place. The blockade, as Amnesty International said, was a flagrant violation of international law. The blockade, as all international human rights organizations said, was a form of collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. If Israel did not have the right to impose a blockade, then it obviously did not have the right to use force to enforce the blockade. That's just a basic principle of law. And the basic principle of law is you cannot get a right from a wrong. I know that sounds both simple and complicated, but it's really not complicated at all. It simply means if you're committing a wrongful act to begin with, then you can't have any right to enforce the wrongful act. If the blockade itself was illegal, then Israel plainly did not have any legal right to enforce an illegal blockade. And there, as I said, the finding of the Human Rights Commission investigators confirmed that basic point. Israel never even pretended or claimed that the flotilla was carrying weapons to Gaza. They knew full well that the flotilla was simply carrying humanitarian aid to Gaza, and they had no right to deprive the hungry and impoverished people of Gaza of that humanitarian aid. And in fact, on the other side, the passengers aboard the Freedom Flotilla, carrying humanitarian aid to a beleaguered population, had every right to use force in self-defense against a pirate-like raid. But let's, for the sake of argument, for argument's sake, say Israel did have the right to block the passage of the flotilla. The question still remains, why did it use violent force? It had other options. It could have disabled the propeller on the boat. It could have disabled the rudder. It could have disabled the engine and then just towed the boat to an Israeli port. Israel has a formidable navy. It could simply have blocked the boats from going to Gaza. Even if you take Israel's own argument, its resort to force makes no sense. After the attack, Israel kept saying on its behalf, we didn't expect the passengers on the boat to violently resist. We thought it would just be civil disobedience, non-violence. But then the obvious question arises. If you didn't believe there was going to be resistance, and you thought they were just going to engage in non-violent civil disobedience, why did you attack the boat in the dead of night? Why didn't you just board it in broad daylight? Why didn't you bring a lot of journalists to show the world that you were not looking for a fight? If you didn't expect any violence, why didn't you use a commando unit trained to kill? Why didn't you use a police unit trained to handle civil resistance? The only reasonable inference is that Israel wanted a bloody confrontation, although probably not on the scale that ensued after the Israeli commandos panicked, after the passengers determined resistance, and as the Israeli commandos panicked, they exacted more deaths. Why exactly Israel used force, why it chose violent force, is a matter of speculation, but it was not entirely surprising, because Israel at first, there had been about 8 boats which tried to enter Gaza in the past year and a half. The first boats Israel let pass because it figured, we'll let these kids have their good time, we'll let the boats pass, the public will lose interest in it, and then the organizers will give up. But the boats kept coming. So then Israel, I think it was the 6th boat to Gaza, Israel rammed a boat. But the boats kept coming. Then Israel intercepted a boat and took it to Israel, to a port in Israel. But the boats kept coming. And so it was unsurprising that at some point, to stop this nonviolent civil resistance, Israel would resort to murderous force. It's exactly what they did in the West Bank with the nonviolent demonstrations at places like Bile'im, resisting Israel's wall. At first, Israel allowed the demonstrations to go on, hoping that people would lose interest as the media lost interest. But the demonstrations kept getting bigger, and the demonstrations kept getting bigger, until Israel started to use murderous force against the nonviolent resistors in the West Bank. So as one Israeli columnist put it, he said, what happened in the Mavi Marmara is very similar to what Israel has been doing every week for the past 4 years in the village of Bile'im, injuring and killing unarmed civilian protesters who are demanding their basic rights.